Hi guys, so today's video is going to be another funny one-star review, specifically this time for The Blade Itself, which is the first book in Joe Abercrombie's First Law Trilogy. If you've never seen these videos on my channel, it's where I take a popular book that, for the most part, a lot of people really love and it's highly praised, and I find the people that hate the book and I read off the one-star reviews that I find amusing. You don't have to have read the book to watch this. None of the reviews are going to have spoilers, and also I'll give you a brief synopsis of the book so that way you have a little bit of context for the reviews. Also, before we get into it, if you are wondering why my books are primarily turned around, I will have a link down below to fill you in. Getting into it though, The Blade Itself is a story that follows a handful of main characters. One is somebody who was tortured and became a torturer. One of them is kind of a spoiled brat that is in the military. One is his friend who is a commoner trying to establish himself despite the way society views people of his status. And then we also follow a character from the North who's kind of this man that has a dark past but seems kind of lovable. The story is very character driven. The characters themselves are really the main focus, especially in this first one, because you don't really know what the plot of the book is. You really focus on their arcs and their development. It is known for being grimdark, and it also takes a few tropes that we've seen in the past in fantasy, but it kind of turns them around a little bit, and they definitely appear a little more bleak than maybe we're accustomed to. That's a little brief synopsis of The Blade Itself. Now that you have that, we can get into the reviews. Jumping into it, the first one says, after reading Glokta's intro, Glokta is one of the main characters, I was convinced the characters were actually lizards. So much focus on him licking his teeth and gums and the fact that he's a cripple, but no other kind of descriptions to convince me he wasn't a lizard man. Honestly, this would have been a much more interesting read if it had been about humanoid lizards. This one says, I would recommend to try reading something else that won't make you lose IQ points, because I felt I did after this one. The next one says, the writing? Okay, the writing is bad. It's fumbling, it's clunky, it's articulated with poorly thought out stops at the end of sentences. It's like a ride on a clunky, herky-jerky public transit bus whose driver doesn't know the meaning of soft brakes. This next one says, understand that at the end of it, you will have two choices. Read the rest of the series in order to find out what is supposed to be going on, or two, highly recommended, shrug your shoulders, dump the book on some poor, unsuspecting soul at half-price books, and move on to more productive uses of your time, like knocking over liquor stores. This one says, 100 pages left and I stopped reading. Yep, 100 to go, not 100 into it. The characters were flat. I didn't give a flying fig about any of them. Some of them seemed to pop in and out of the story for no particular reason. I couldn't figure out what the book was supposed to be about. Nothing really happened. One guy went from point A to point B, picked up someone, and they went to point C, picked up someone else, and traveled to point D. Apparently, they've picked up yet another person, and are going to point E, but I lost interest in the why of it all. This next one says, if he's a rising new voice in fantasy, then fantasy is doomed. This next one says, if you've ever wondered what Game of Thrones would look like on basic cable with a tenth of budget and talent, this book is for you. The characters are not compelling. The plot is not interesting. For a book with a name like The Blade Itself, there are very few blades. I let the book blurbs convince me that this book was witty and exciting. It wasn't. The writing itself was all right, if a little clunky, and sometimes oddly phrased in a confusing way. But I never cared about anyone or anything in this book, which is very rare for me. This next one says, lots of heavy violence, bad words, and gore, with some humor in its own way, but the feeling the book and world gave me, A, was neat. A decently built world, which is unusual because A, you don't see those very often, and B, I was only 52 pages into the book when I stopped because of the F-bomb. So much lost potential if the author had just kept the language a little cleaner. Next one says, the story was boring, and the language was just jarring. I'm not a prude in my books, but when it gets to be every other word, it's a bit much. For anyone that's wondering who hasn't read the books, it's not every other word. This person gives us their initial thoughts when they first started, and then later they add their final thoughts. So we're gonna get both. It starts off by saying, just started. So far, it's pretty obvious that the author is into gaming. Everyone is adult and male. No women, no children, no elderly, hardly any animals. The existing ones being more like cars than living things. A setting a lot like a video game. Also, little details like a coat instead of a cloak. Oh, I can understand how that came about. The author must have thought, everyone in fantasy wears cloaks. Let my character have a coat instead. That's so postmodern. Only having a coat and a separate blanket when you're traveling on foot and through the wild is hugely impractical, unless you have access to modern synthetic fabrics and insulation. And a character making stew, in the open, out of freshly killed meat in the mountains, indicate that he himself is no outdoorsman. The style is pretty decent. All those small mistakes wouldn't have bugged me so much if it was more of a generic noble hero saves the world fantasy. Okay, I give up. I can't drag this any longer. It's been a month and I've barely read a third. The characters are interesting, but the story is terrifyingly dull. As someone on G.R.R. Martin's forum pointed out, Joe Abercrombie is a good writer, but a poor storyteller. I may return to this book someday, but for now, it's 1 star. This next one says, is the first act your favorite part of the book? Do you love setup and not care about resolution? If so, then this is the book for you. 500 pages taken to move some characters around and then do nothing with them. There is an awful lot of setup going on in this book, but unfortunately, everything it leads to must be in one of the sequels because there really isn't anything important that happens in this book. This next one says, sometimes I wonder if publishers are doing experiments on us by releasing different versions of the same book to see how we react. I wish I'd gotten the version of this book where anything interesting happened, but I think I must have been in the control group or something. The book I read had perfunctory world building, a few references to uninspiring magic. Then the wizard made some flames, sort of stuff. A cast of characters with a single defining characteristic each, usually some variant on bitterness, that don't interact in meaningful ways. No apparent plot, no detectable themes or recurring imagery, and pedestrian prose. It wasn't the worst fantasy book I've read. I wasn't actively repulsed by it, but it's the least interesting book I've finished in years. I usually get drawn into books and finish the last fourth or so in one big go, but I put this one down a chapter or two from the end because I got sleepy. Reading the other reviews, I really can't help but feel they must have read a different book. I don't get it. This one says, this reads like K.J. Parker's third grade English essays, after he imprinted on anti-heroes and violent misogyny, but before he developed a sense of humor or learned to write. There's a lot of tone-deaf repetition, like describing the marks left on the floor where a victim struggled vainly to get away. He had failed. Yes, we know he failed because that's what vainly means. We also get a lot of lazy shorthand, like dumb blonde, evil lisping albino, and dude with freaky tattoos and a brooding presence who radiates ominous evil and is actually named Fenris the Feared. My best friend recommended this to me. I should have remembered that he also recommended R.A. Salvatore and Rick Riordan. Oh, and you can tell the bad guys because they hiss instead of talking. This next one, their entire review says, I hate to say it, but this book sucks. The next one says, yeah, first few pages and it feels really amateur. Really barf. I could go to any writing fantasy forum and read an exhaustive G.I. Joe battle scene with multiple cringes anytime without having to pay a cent. This next one's from Amazon. It says, the vulgar language cheapens the writer's talented. No other words are needed really. An interesting story, but I'll not read anything more of his unimaginative expletives when other writers are capable and use their talent to create rather than using the same low and filthy phrases and adjectives the entire book. This one urges us. It says, please don't read this book. This next one says, yucky! This book seems to have a Game of Thrones identity crisis, yet has no distinguishing factors to justify its existence. If you think the humor element is what distinguishes it, my answer is that this book isn't so much humorous as it is not serious. This book just seems to be 1/3 of a 3-book story, but as a single novel, it has no standalone merits. This one reads, I know when a book grabs me, keeps me in. This isn't it. From the writing is choppy and boring, like reading a manual for a hammer. I found my mind wandering around. Seems like probably a first novel. The author does not know how to connect with the readers of this genre. The next one says, if none of your characters are likable, can your book be likable? Human characteristics are important to human characters. This one says, Each word was grueling. Each character introduction was like dragging my eyeballs across sandpaper. I would thoroughly recommend holding your breath until you die rather than read this. This one says, "This was too violent for me. I quit reading it. Sadly, I had also bought the second book of the trilogy, so now I have 2 books I won't read." This last one is super long, but I want to read it in its entirety because I find it really funny. Jumping into it, it says, "Inside the front cover of the paperback is a picture of Joe Blowhard in a conceited pose, to say the least, wearing French cuffs, one pressed and one unpressed, and a cheap brown suit. It is obvious that he has a very high opinion of himself. I can't imagine why. His characters are not very believable. The not very noblemen all have a contrived Dan in their names to show their high status. This kind of thing has been done before by many other authors and is anything but novel or interesting. Giselle Luthar is just one of many characters who do not have any credibility or depth. He and they are comic book characters at best. Here this guy is, somehow promoted as a captain in the military, without any training apparently, except at fencing. He has no combat experience, no known military abilities, and commands no men. More than anything else, he is the equivalent of a drunken, spoiled frat boy. His emotions in the book almost never ring true and seem to be very immature, and yet he is somehow a captain in the military. Glocta is similarly non-plausible character. Just because the author can have any weird thought does not mean he should put it in his book. It should work and be part of a greater whole. Glocta transformed by torture by the enemy from military hero to torturer and inquisitor of his own people. It is a complete non-starter. Abercrombie didn't know that many other people have read Tolkien and are familiar with Frodo Ninefingers, or maybe he just copied it anyway. That seems very possible. Logan and the other members of his crew are also bogus characters, unless, of course, as mentioned previously, your tastes run to reading comic books. Even the reviews are a bad parody. There is a gritty edge to his world and an awareness of the human cost of violence that is very contemporary. Fake. Immediate, daring, and utterly entertaining. Fake. Lord of the Rings, as directed by Kurosawa. Fake. On the acknowledgements page, Righteous Joe thanks 7 people. The first 4 are all Abercrombies, and he claims all have sore body parts. How unusual and boring. But that is part of his undeserved vanity. There is another picture of him near the back of the book, the same smug one as before. Lou Abercrombie is credited for the picture. Thanks, Lou. All in all, a worthless book. Apparently, just one of many that Tyro Joe has written and gotten published. Now, you might say I am wrong, and look at all the books he has sold. But here's some food for thought. McDonald's has sold billions of burgers to the masses, and very few people will claim it is anything but cheap fast food. Anyway, that is it for some funny 1-star reviews, or at least I found them amusing in some fashion, of The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. If these reviews have piqued your interest for the First Law Trilogy, I have reviews for each of the books. I'll link them down below, and if you're like, I don't even need to hear any more, I'm sold. I'll have some purchase links linked down below as well. Definitely let me know which one of these was your favorite, and if you're interested in seeing more funny 1-star review videos, I'll have my playlist linked. I've done these for a lot of books, but if you have suggestions for other books you'd like me to do this for, feel free to let me know. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.